Hello and welcome to this tutorial where I'm going to take a look at how we can go about making arcade games in Crayta. So in this context, when I'm talking about arcade games, I'm talking about games which you can go up to and play in your game. Sometimes used as mini games, sometimes used as the main game. But essentially it's a way that you completely take control of the player. So when I've interacted with the test your strength machine, it's completely taken control of my player. I can't move around, I can't look around or anything like that. All I can do is bash with R and E to build power and press spacebar to slam the hammer. And essentially that's my arcade game. Now, how do you go about building a game where you essentially just take control of the player and you put them in their own situation like that? Let's look at it from a blank template. Now, I'm going to use advanced mode for this, so I must caveat it by saying that you're going to need to use a mouse and keyboard to follow along with this tutorial and to make this game. And I should also say that this is the way that I figured out how to do it, and you might have a better way or a different way. There's not necessarily the ultimate solution to this problem. There are lots of different ways to solve it, and they all depend really on the kind of game you're making, the kind of arcade game you're making, how much time you've got, all of that kind of stuff. So yeah, there's no right or wrong solution. This is just one way of doing it. So now that I've said that, let's break down what we need to do. So there were several elements going on there in that game. Firstly, there was the game mechanic itself in the arcade game. So that's the point I started with, is the game mechanic itself. I love arcade games because the game mechanics are usually quite simple, but can be quite challenging, and they ramp up their difficulty. But they need to be really simple and straightforward to get to grips with. If you think about an arcade, it's people just turning up and playing arcade machines, and they, will likely play them for 5-10 minutes and then on to the next machine. So you need to grab their attention in that 5-10 minutes. And so, yeah, keeping it simple, that's really cool and really good fun too. So yeah, it's a hammer game. So that was the first thing, is the arcade game mechanic itself. Then you've also got the arcade game UI, which is displayed on the user. So we need to turn that on. And then there's also the taking control of the player part of it. So what we do there is we essentially despawn the current player and spawn them in with the player that we want them to have, so that it's got all of the things that we need to have on the player just for that specific arcade game. It means that you can make multiple mini games in a bigger game, and it's great for leaderboards and challenges. We'll get onto that. Okay, so I have a blank slate, apart from I've added sawdust to the floor. So let's look first at the game mechanic for my arcade game, which was to essentially build up power of the hammer. So I'm going to go to my player template to do this, and I'm just going to add a hammer. So let's use the test your strength hammer. Now you'll find that when you do this, firstly, it wiggles around quite a lot like this, and that's because it's colliding with my player's hitbox. So let's just move it. And let's move it up a little bit, and we can actually test and just see whereabouts that is. Yeah, that looks okay. So now that we've done that, let's also change our player so that we can't do anything except look at this hammer. So we're going to turn off visible, and then we're just going to remove all of the movement stuff for the player. So set those to 0, uncheck all of these. You can leave the name up, uncheck can crouch, reduce the interaction range. So usually this is at 1000, but you can reduce it to 100, just in case when we come to do the bit where you warp into the arcade world, the interaction range, you might find that you constantly are respawning the player if that's too high and you're looking at the thing that you're using to spawn. So yeah, reducing that, maybe turn off damage. Let's just turn off collisions, and to fix the camera, we can choose orbit. We can choose camera angle lock, make sure that yaw and pitch are both set to 0. Or you can, set those to whatever number you might need them to be for your arcade game. And I've set my camera distance to be about 300. I'm going to turn off camera collision, but it shouldn't really matter for this one. Let's just test those. Yeah, so essentially we have a really simple fixed view. Okay, so now that we've got that bit, let's start working on the mechanic itself. So we've got a hammer. And I want to essentially build up some power. And when I build up the power, I want to change the angle that the hammer is at. So to change the angle of the hammer, I could do that just by rotating the hammer. And that's perfectly cool. But if you wanted to, you could also add a locator. If you wanted to change the pivot point around which the hammer rotates, you could add a locator like this. And then let's call this the hammer locator. And then essentially add that to your hammer, zero out the position on the locator, and then return it back to the player and then put the hammer on there. So now it's fixed on there. We can actually just move the hammer up maybe on the Z-axis. And now when I rotate the locator, you can see that it's moving it around a different pivot point. So that's something I did. You might want to forego that step, but now I add all of my hammer control logic to this hammer locator, which is a child of the player. So I clicked on hammer locator, click entity, create child, no, add script, new script, and I'm going to call this hammer controller script. Just realized there's an old script in here. Let's just delete that, just so that we don't get confused. So hammer controller script. In my hammer controller script, I'm going to need to capture some button presses. So the way we do that is in a function. In a function. Hammer controller script on button pressed, and then it says called on player and user script when a particular button is pressed, giving the string name of the button. So I can use the argument name here, which is button name, and that is the name of the button the user just pressed. So let's interrogate that button name and see if it's one of the buttons I wanted them to press. So if the button name, and the buttons I'm using for this particular game is extra 1, and I'm using, because I wanted 2 buttons to bash it like this, button name is extra 1, or button name is extra 2, like that. Then double equals there. To a single equals here would essentially replace whatever's in button name with this extra 1. So you're essentially, you're assigning this data to that variable with a single equals. With a double equals like this, you're asking, is this the same as this? So that's the difference between a single equals and a double equals. If you use JavaScript, then you have 3 equal signs, which means really equal to. Okay, so we've got those 2 button names. Yes, so the next thing to do is let's make some power with that. Actually, let's just check that works. Print bash. Okay, open the console. R is one of them, Q is the other one. Bash, 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 bash. Perfect. Okay, so we know that we can get hold of these button inputs. So now we need to create a power variable. So let's just do that in the init here. Self.power is 0. Power is going to be a number between 0 and 1. That's the range of my power variable. 0 is I haven't pressed a single button. I'm not even trying. 1 is how are you doing that? That's incredibly strong and your hammer is going to go berserk. So 0, 1 is the range of my power. I'm also going to need a number to increment this by. And that's just how much to up it by every time I hit a button. So this is going to be my power increment. And I'm going to store it in a variable, in a property up here, because it means I can tweak it easier in the entity editor at the side. So if I go here and here, I can see it'll probably appear down there in a minute. The type is a number. I might just get rid of this to keep it tidy. Okay. Need some default, probably. Default is 0.1 and the tooltip is the amount to increase power each button bash. Cool. Okay, so I've got that. Now, when I hit one of these, I want to increase my power by that number. Self.power equals self.power plus self.properties.power increment. So whatever power was before, add this number to it and assign it back into power. Let's try that. Okay, I got rid of the print statement. That's fine. Print power. Let's output what that is so we can see whether that's working. Yep, cool. However, it's incrementing by 0.1 every time. Now, there's a couple of issues with that. One of them is that the closer you get to 1, the more difficult it should be to increment it. So you never quite reach 1. The best arcade games have an infinite score where you can't like top out. So we need to add that. So the way we do that is we just multiply our power increment by 1 minus self.power. So if we do the maths on that, and we need to do some brackets here for 1 minus self.power and then some brackets here. You don't actually need those brackets there, but I like to use brackets and know that the order just because sometimes what if I'm wrong. So the reason this works is as the power increases by 0.1, we have, so to start with, this will be 1 minus 0, which is 1. So it will increment by 1 times power increment. Power increment is 0.1. So 1 times 0.1 is 0.1. Add that to power, and that's 0.1. Now, the next time I hit a button, the power will be 0.1. So it will say 0.1 plus power increment, which is 0.1, times 1 minus power, which was 0.1. So now it's the power increment times 0.9. 1 minus 0.1 is 0.9. And so as you can see, that will gradually get smaller the closer we get to 1, and you'll never actually be able to reach 1. Let's have a look at that. So the closer I'm getting to 1, the better. I can get closer and closer and closer, but I can never reach it, which means we never top out, which is perfect. Now, the other thing that happens in that arcade game is every frame, I actually reduce the amount so that it could go back to 0 unless you keep it up. So for that one, we're going to have a name of a new variable, a new property called power decrement. And what that's going to do is just take something away every frame. The average user can probably button bash about the same speed, maybe not quite as fast as the frames will update. Let's find out. That might be important. Or we can just fudge it and trial and error it. Decrement, we're going to do 0.1 again. The tooltip should say the amount to reduce power each tick. Like that. I'm getting an error because I don't have a comma there. There we go. Okay. Now to implement that, let's add our onTick function. Hammer controller script onTick. OnTick. To keep it consistent, we should really use the delta time as well. So delta time is the amount of time that's passed since the last time onTick was called. So it's usually quite a small number. So I might have to increase my power decrement to take that into account. But let's just reduce the power. Let's say if self.power is greater than 0, then reduce it. Else, let's clamp it at 0 and end there. So we're going to reduce it in here. So self.power equals self.power minus self.properties.power decrement. That, oh, times delta time. And let's, again, we don't need to have these brackets because the order is mathematically correct, but let's just do it. I just like doing it. It gives me confidence in my code. Okay. What? Have I got rid of my print statement again? Yes. Okay. Print power. Self.power. Let's just output it whenever I hit a button. So should be seeing, yeah, it is going down. Yeah. If I hit the button, this would have been better in the on tick. How close can I get it to 1? Okay, so I'm going fairly reasonably arcade hard. 0.93 is as close as I can get it on my membrane keyboard. And that's pretty good. I'm happy with 0.93 being the max I can get there, because someone with a controller or clickety-clack kind of keys will probably be able to reach 1 or close to 1. If I was unhappy with that and I wanted to make it harder, I could increase this number just on the default. If I wanted to make it easier, I could reduce this number so that less is taken away each tick. But for now, I'm just going to keep it at 0.1. So that's my number, my maths stuff, kind of sorted. Now I just need to map that range of 0 to 1 onto the hammer angle and how, yeah, the hammer angle, essentially. So 0 should be where it is at the moment, like this. And one thing we can do is just rotate it to the maximum we want it, which is probably around here. So that's 90, that's minus 135. So minus 45, minus 90, minus 135 on the, what axis is this? The x-axis. Okay, so the max is 1, and that needs to be minus 135, and the min is 0, and that needs to be 0. So let's do this in the on tick. If the power is greater than 0, yeah, we can do it outside of that. So we need a reference to our hammer. Let's do that. So firstly, reference to the hammer, name equals, wait, we're on the hammer. We're on the hammer locator. We don't need a reference to the hammer. That's get entity. Okay, so reference the hammer self, get entity, set rotation, rotation.new, pitch your roll. So the first is the one we're after. So that's minus 135, which is our maximum angle that we want, times self.power, which is a number between 0 and 1. So when it's maximum self.power, it will be minus 135. When I haven't done any, it will be 0. Cool. 0, 0 for the other two. Save that and let's run it and let's see what happens. Okay, so it's not quite right. I think this is, it's rotated it because it must have been already rotated. So let's go to the player. The hammer is, yeah, it needs to be possibly on the Y axis. Or on the Z. It can be on the Z. Okay, great. Let's go back to the hammer. So the hammer seems to have rotated itself. If I put that at 90. There we go. Pow. I feel like the decrement can certainly come up, because it's going down really slow. Let's tweak that. Let's make the decrement 0.5. Yeah, and then make the increment more as well to counteract it. Something like that. Okay, cool. Yeah, that feels nice. Okay, so we've got our hammer and it's rotating according to those things. According to that, we've mapped those values. I'm just going to move it down a couple of pegs. Pow. So that's that part of it. The next thing to look at is the next mechanic, which is when you press jump, I want to make it so that the hammer fires forward. So that, again, we're going to be going into the on button pressed. And we're going to make an else if, actually. Else if button name is jump. Then. And here we're going to fire the hammer. So this is essentially going to change the state of the hammer from something that you're pulling back to something that you're throwing forward. So let's add a really tiny state machine, or it's not the perfect state machine, but self.fired is false to start with, and then only do this bit if if not self.fired, then do this chunk of code like that, else. So there, that's nice. And then here we're just going to change self.fired is true. And something else we can do is self get entity, and we can use the alter rotation, which essentially changes the rotation of our hammer. It will change the rotation of our hammer to whatever we specify over an amount of time. So we're taking the hammer, pulling back away from the whole interaction, and we're replacing it with something automated. And where I want this to go is rotation.0, rotation.new, and I want 00115. So that's where I want the hammer to land. And I want it to do that in 0.15 seconds. So, space. There we go. So that's it, throwing the hammer forwards. And that's the crux of our game mechanic. We've got a really, really simple game mechanic. We just need to dress up the level and stuff now. So you can kind of do that however you want to. The first thing we're going to need to do is, okay, so the next thing we need to do is spawn in our player. So we currently we're automatically going into this fixed view thing. And we're just, we can't interact with it in any other way. And what if we wanted to add other arcade games? And what if we wanted to do other stuff in this level? What if we wanted this to be a small part of a much larger thing? That's totally fine. And that's partly what this tutorial is about as well. So let's look at how we might do that. So we've got our basic arcade mechanic, and now we need to create a way for the player to interact with something and then be presented with that view rather than going straight into that view. So the way we do that is if we go to the templates, I'm going to duplicate this player and I'm going to call this hammer player. And that's going to be the player that is looked after in the arcade game. And my player is going to be normal player. So should have now two templates in here in the template navigator. And if I click on player and hammer player, they're essentially the same. The player, I'm going to get rid of the hammer and I'm going to return the player's defaults back to how it was. So we're going to do that. Going to put jump height back to 1, can sprint, can jump, can mantle, can slide, roll, brake fall. I might change the speed to 0.5 so they have to walk around, and turn off sprinting. So, you know, they're walking around the arcade. They can crouch. There's no damage. and they can collide. And let's turn the camera back to action. And there. So now I can run around again. Really slow running around. That's cool. Got that. So let's now create a way for us to enter an arcade game. So we're going to use a mesh. We're going to go with our test your strength machine. And let's just put it here. And let's add a script. That's not the one I want. That's the one I want. Let's add a script to that. This is going to be called Start Hammer Game Script. I like really verbose names for my classes because it's very descriptive, but it takes a while to write out. That's okay. Okay, so what we're going to do is create a function in here that essentially we need to call when the player interacts with this thing called Start Game. And in here, we're going to get hold of the player. So when you interact with something, your player gets passed as one of the arguments, which is really handy because we need that. So we're going to now store the user. So to spawn and despawn players, we need to use the user for that part of it. We can get the user from the player. So player get user is the command to do that. And we're storing it in this local variable here called user. With the user, we can do despawn player. We can even do it with an effect if we want to. I'm just going to do it purely standard like that. And then we can actually spawn in the player that we want to. Spawn player. Now it's asking us for a player template. So we're going to need a property for that. Let's add one of those. So the name is going to be Hammer Game Player Template. No. Yeah. That's what no, player template. We know this is the Hammer game. It's called Start Hammer Game Script. Player template. The type is a template. That should do. I think that's descriptive enough. I don't need a tooltip. So we need self.properties.player template. And then we need to select that. So once I've saved that, that property comes up down here and I can select my hammer player. And then I just need to hook up the interact and drag that into there, make sure the script's selected, and then choose the event Start Game. Let's see if that works. So I'm a player and I can run around and then I interact with this thing. My players interact was like, I reduced it, didn't I, to 100 centimeters. Let's make it 1,000. 1,000 on this one and 100 on the hammer player. Okay, now I'm facing the wrong way and I'm a bit too close. Now that's because what I really need to do now is add a locator or rotate the player and all of that kind of thing. And you can actually do that in the spawn player function. So let's go back to this. Let's just move this way a little bit. Let's add a locator to it. So it's added as a child. And now I'm just going to move it back this way. This is going to be called my hammer spawn point. I'm going to change this to be hammer game. So it's all very, very clear. Hammer game, hammer spawn point. In my start hammer game script, I need to reference that spawn point. Player spawn, type is an entity, is locator. Scrolling down in here, player spawn, and we can either drag and drop or select it from that drop down menu. And in my spawn player now, I should do self.properties. Player spawn. You can actually give it a locator entity to spawn on. Let's see how we get on with my locator. Okay. So it's spawning, but it's spawning below the terrain. And it's also facing the wrong way, maybe. So let's go back to this. Let's get this thing, the locator. Let's move it up. Hammer player. Let's just make sure. Can sprint. Yep. Okay, it does need collisions. Interestingly, don't think that's quite right. I think I need to do get position. I think you can do position and rotation. Let's do it that way. Self.properties.player spawn. Get rotation. Okay, so this was a mixture of things, but essentially where you've got your player, the reason that this bug occurs is because where you've got your player, your hammer player, set to orbit camera type, this basically means that the direction the player is facing bears no resemblance to which direction the camera is pointing. That's down to camera yaw. So you might have to configure your camera yaw and your player, the hammer, and the rotation of the hammer, as well as the rotation of this entity that you're playing around with in the world. Essentially, you want the spawn point locator. You want that to be pointing at your entity that you want to interact with. If you get stuck, a good way to debug this is to actually just draw some big different blocks around your game world to tell you which direction you're facing. Might help you to debug the direction part of the spawn point logic. But now I have fixed mine by moving some stuff around in my game world. If I run over here and then interact with it, you can see that it is smack bang in the middle of the screen. So the locator alignment is correct, but now my hammer is a little bit far away. And now I need to do essentially some tweaking to get my hammer to the perfect point and my spawn point to the perfect location. So if I move my spawn point forward a bit, then I'll just grab my hammer, and that needs to move. I feel like it needs to, yes, move this way, closer to the player. I might rotate the start as well because it takes a minute to, yeah. Okay, so we need the hammer to go more that way. So we're just tweaking this hammer here, the hammer locator. Let's move it there and let's just see what that does. Okay, so that's moved it across the screen. That wasn't ideal. So we'll go back to the hammer player, undo that, and then let's move it this way. Okay, so it's the exact opposite of that way. Hammer locator that way. Yeah. Okay, a little bit more tweaking. Okay, so I've tweaked it and we now have, if I interact with this and if I just press space to see where the hammer lands on the device. And that's essentially the crux of the beginning of an arcade game. Now, if I wanted to, I could do some stuff in here, like when I fire the jump, I could call a bunch of functions which maybe send that to the leaderboard. So if you're interested in doing some leaderboard stuff, you can totally do that. You go over to this game tab over here and just add a leaderboard. Give it a name such as Hammer leaderboard, Hammer Slammer as the domain as the display name, and then in your game code, you just would, when they fire this, go leaderboards dot. Oh, actually, I need to get hold of the user. Well, fortunately, that is where I am. I'm in the player. So self get entity get parent. That's the player, the character. Get user. Let's just type leaderboard. Here we go. Add to leaderboard value. Add a number to the leaderboard value on the specified leaderboard for this user. Brilliant. Add to the hammer leaderboard. I want to add my power at this point. There you go. So just by doing that, I've now added that score to that leaderboard. We can test that by, on the init function, we would need to get hold of the leaderboard as we came in. So we could totally go down that road. It would also be possible to add some challenges here. And I've done a tutorial on the challenges on YouTube before. The great thing is that now there is creator challenges within the game itself. So you don't need to go to create.crayta.com anymore to make the challenges. You can just do that right there, which is super duper. Let's just delete that. So could add some leaderboards, add some challenges. The other thing we might need to look at here is now we have essentially changed the character to a new character. What about adding some user interface, some UI? So if I go to my user, I don't have anything at the moment. So let's create a script folder. This is going to be my Hammer UI. In there, I'm going to add a widget like this, Hammer UI, and I'm also going to add a script to control that widget, Hammer UI script, like that. And we'll make this invisible to start with because the user is different from the player. So the player changes and we can despawn and respawn players and spawn new player templates, but the user is always the same, and the user is where you're going to want to put your user interface. So essentially what we need to do now is call up the user interface from our Hammer game script. So we could do that in lots and lots of different ways to do that. But essentially, one way might be to turn it off visible to start with, and then go to the Hammer start Hammer game script. And then when the user starts playing the game, we go user, and then we need to get hold of the widget. So we do that with Hammer UI, and then we can do show. Now that might not work because that needs to happen locally. So we can see that it hasn't worked because that needs to happen locally. So what we could do here is in my Hammer UI, in my user, go into here, into my Hammer UI user script and do show UI. And then do self get entity Hammer UI show like that. And then in this script where I've tried to do it here, we just do user, and we need to send to local. Because what that will do is it will call event name on all scripts of this entity on the client that owns the player or user this script is attached to. Script entity sent to local, and the name of the event show UI, and we don't need any arguments for this one. And there you go. So it's now displaying a UI. Now, I'm not going to go through customizing the UI this time around, but essentially now that it's displaying, we use a really similar method in the Hammer controller script. If you wanted to update your power, I would do that something like something quite regularly, maybe have some scheduled process which updates the UI. Yeah, so you could do that in here. And the way you would get hold of the user in here, we are actually on the player. So you could do something like, self get, like just like we did here, to get hold of the user. But we also need to send this. We'll need a local version of our power. So let's just set this up so that we can do that. Hammer controller script. Local init like this, and then self.power is 0, and then we need a way to update. Actually, let's just do updating. Let's do updating the power. So we've got local init and it sets up that power. So function, let's just do a update local power. And we're going to need to pass a number in there. And then self.power equals power. So we should do that local. This is the way we're going to do things locally. So when we have our on tick, at the end of that function, we should do self send to local. The event is update local power, and the number will be self.power. So essentially we're managing that we've got a power that the player has managed to build up on the server, and we need to send that to the local machine, because the user interface is going to need to have a local version of that variable to update. So that's essentially what we've done there, is we've initialized it here with our local init, and then we've created a function. And it's just like any other function, except that the way I'm calling it, rather than calling self update local power, I'm doing self send to local update local power, and then sending through the power that way. And you could even then use this update local power as our way to talk to the UI script, but try and avoid doing that on the on tick if possible. It's good to schedule that, right? So yeah, so we have our interaction, which replaces the player. It comes up with a customized UI, and it begins our game specific game mechanic. So it takes control of our buttons, and it's essentially a fully fledged game, except there's a lot more polish that could be added to it. We need to do things like communicate to the player that they're building up some power. So you could do that using effect. You could do that with sounds. I think the way I did it before, I changed the time of day as well. So you can show the player that they're building up power in some way, and then send their score to a leaderboard, and process the leaderboard and show the user where they are, because that's going to be, or show the player where they are, because that's going to be really important for them to enjoy the game, is showing them what score they achieved on the leaderboard, and hopefully asking them to play again, and then exiting and despawning their player and respawning using some kind of button, and then communicating the buttons to the player. So there's a few more things to do with the arcade game, but the crux of it is essentially, now that we've talked it through, you could set up a few different arcade games. You could have a whole arcade menagerie, or just you should just call that an arcade, really, but the menagerie is fine. It's because the birds are tweeting in my game. You could set up a whole arcade game area, or you could just make odd arcade games and just spawn the player automatically into this, give them some instructions. And yeah, I really have enjoyed making arcade games, and I hope that this has helped some of you to think about possible ways that you might make arcade games. and I look forward to seeing your arcade games in Crayta.